The snow had begun to fall early that year in the quiet village of Little Withering. It lay thick across the rooftops and hedgerows like a white woolen blanket, muffling sound and lending the cottages a fairy-tale charm. The villagers spoke in hushed voices at the tea shop, for there had been an incident at Grange Hollow, the oldest house on the eastern edge of town. A murder, they said, though no one could yet explain how or why. Grange Hollow had stood empty for years until the week before Christmas. Then quite suddenly, its heavy gates had creaked open, and the lights had come on in the windows again. For some, it was like watching a ghost stir to life. For Grange Hollow had once belonged to the Dandridge family, wealthy, eccentric, and not altogether liked. And now it was young Eliza Dandridge, the last of the line, who had returned. Orphaned at 16 after the car crash that killed her parents, Eliza had vanished from the village soon after the funeral. A ward of the state, some said. Others whispered of a bitter inheritance dispute, or that she had run away. Now, 28, she had returned, taller, quieter, and more reserved than any had remembered, her dark hair always pulled tightly back, her voice soft but precise. She claimed she wished to spend just one last Christmas at the house of her childhood, before selling it and moving abroad. The villagers accepted her presence as best they could. She shopped at the bakery. She greeted old neighbours. And on the night of December 23rd, she hosted a small gathering at Grange Hollow, inviting a handful of people who had known her family best: Reverend Elliot and his wife Margaret, her old governess Miss Colcombe, Mr. Silas Trent, the family solicitor, and Arthur Fenimore, her father's old friend and hunting companion. The evening passed quietly by all accounts. Wine, firelight, a bit of carolling, then guests began departing around 10. Eliza herself escorted each one to the door. The house was locked up by 10:30, and by morning Arthur Fenimore was dead. The discovery was made by Silas Trent, who had returned early the next day to deliver a final batch of legal documents. He found the front door ajar and the library in disarray. Fenimore lay slumped in a leather armchair near the hearth, a poker protruding grotesquely from the side of his head. Blood had dried into the rug, and one window pane had been shattered inward. At first glance it seemed a straightforward, if grisly, case of breaking and entering. Yet no valuables had been taken. A crystal decanter remained untouched on the sideboard. A jewelled clock ticked steadily. Eliza's handbag, left on a table in plain sight, was undisturbed. Then there was the window. Though broken from the outside, there were no footprints in the snow below it, none leading to it or away, not even disturbed drifts. More strangely still, the inside of the room had been locked from within. The only keys were on Eliza's person and in a locked drawer at the solicitor's office. Scotland Yard was contacted, but it was Miss Jane Marple, invited by Reverend Elliot himself, who arrived the next morning. The elderly lady, modestly dressed in tweed and a sensible hat, was greeted with equal parts confusion and scepticism. After all, what good could come of a gossiping spinster from St. Mary Mead? Yet Miss Marple had made her name quietly over the years, solving mysteries that confounded even the Yard. Her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, though she always spoke gently, as if afraid of interrupting. She examined the scene alongside Inspector Bremer, a young man clearly rattled by the contradiction between the physical evidence and common sense. "A locked-room murder, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "Window smashed, no prints, no motive, and the only people in the house were the victim and Miss Dandridge, who claimed she was asleep in the attic. It doesn't add up." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but things rarely do at first glance. I remember once in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Dingley's canary vanished for 3 days and was found in the larder, behind the dried currants. That didn't make sense either, but there was a logic to it once one considered the habits of cats and the design of the pantry door." The inspector gave her a pained smile. "This isn't a canary, Miss Marple. It's a dead man." "Precisely," she said, and turned back to the room. There were no signs of forced entry, save the broken window. But the glass lay mostly outside on the snow, not inside the library as one would expect. The fire had burned low but was still warm. One log had charred along one side as if it had fallen and been hastily shoved back. Eliza, when questioned, was calm. She had gone to bed around 11, she said. She had heard nothing, not even the crash of glass. "I've grown used to silence," she added with a faint smile. London has a way of making one deaf to noise, Miss Marple asked gently. And you've no idea why Mr. Fenimore would return? You parted on good terms. Eliza hesitated. He was polite, but he was close to my father, not to me. I was surprised he even came last night. And your keys, dear? I keep them on my nightstand. I lock the bedroom door. Always have. It was during tea with Miss Colcombe that Miss Marple's mind began to stir in earnest. The governess, now in her 70s, was a dry woman of few illusions. She had cared for Eliza from infancy and spoke of her fondly, if somewhat vaguely. She was always quiet, observant, not fond of dolls, mind you, preferred puzzles, and once when she was 10 she built a perfect copy of the Hollow out of sugar cubes. Imagine. Interesting, said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. And tell me, was she close with Mr. Fenimore? The old woman stiffened. Not particularly. He frightened her, I think. Rough, booming voice. And he drank too much. Yet she invited him. It was expected, Miss Colcombe said. Appearances, you know. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple asked to see the logs for the fire. The woodpile out back was covered by a tarpaulin. All the logs were dry, except one, darker than the rest. Damp, too damp to have come from the pile. Miss Marple frowned, then she smiled. Inspector, she said, may I borrow your constable for an hour? I should like to visit the village station. That night, the guests of Grange Hollow were summoned again. Eliza was composed but curious. You've found something. I believe I have, said Miss Marple. You see, this was not a locked room mystery after all, nor a break-in. She gestured to the fireplace. The killer entered through the chimney. Gasps, then laughter from Silas Trent. Come now, Miss Marple, this isn't a pantomime. And yet, she replied, the soot on the hearth was disturbed. The log knocked askew, and this damp log, placed deliberately to kill the fire's heat before the murderer entered. Clever, really? Risky too. Eliza had gone pale. But why? Who? Miss Marple turned to her. The same person who stood to lose everything if Mr. Fenimore delivered those documents. He had uncovered the truth, hadn't he? That you are not Eliza Dandridge at all. The room froze. I beg your pardon, Trent said. Miss Marple continued. The real Eliza died shortly after the accident, but the body was burned, hard to identify. And you, my dear, took her place. A cousin, perhaps, or a childhood friend from the orphanage. You knew just enough to fool the villagers. But Mr. Fenimore began to suspect. Last night he returned with proof. So you lured him in, waited until the fire died down, and murdered him. Eliza rose slowly. You have no proof. Oh, but we do. Your fingerprints do not match the records from the estate trust. And this morning, the constable found soot on your nightdress, beneath the hem. You climbed into the chimney after locking the room, exited into the library and staged the scene. Eliza, whoever she truly was, said nothing more. And outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle and soft, as though to cover all things, even murder. The snow deepened that night, rising up against the hedges and swallowing the winding lanes that led into and out of Little Withering. Grange Hollow sat quiet once again, its tall windows dark, its gates sealed with police cordon tape that fluttered in the wind like tattered ribbon. The false Eliza Dandridge had been taken into custody, but the village remained uneasy. People spoke her name in whispers, unsure whether to refer to her as Eliza or something else entirely. Her true identity had yet to be uncovered, and still, the motive behind the killing was murky. A case of stolen identity, certainly, but what was she trying to hide? Why murder a man like Arthur Fenimore with such ruthless calculation? Miss Marple remained in the village. She had returned to the vicarage at Reverend Eliot's invitation, sipping weak tea from a delicate cup as the storm raged outside. Her mind, however, was not at rest. It doesn't quite settle, does it? She murmured, half to herself. Reverend Eliot raised an eyebrow. I thought you'd solved it, Miss Marple. She impersonated the heiress, killed the one man who could expose her, and would have made off with the inheritance by New Year's. Open and shut, as they say. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. except I don't believe she wanted the inheritance. But what else could she want? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the frost-webbed window. That, she said, is what troubles me. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Bremer at the small station. He was reviewing transcripts and photographs, clearly exhausted but determined. "I wonder," she said, "whether the chimney theory sat well with you overnight." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "It's strange, I'll grant you that. But the evidence matches. The soot on her nightdress. The timeline." "And yet," she interrupted kindly, "if one has gone to the trouble of inventing a life, moving into Forgotten House and arranging a murder, wouldn't one take care not to leave obvious stains on one's clothing?" The inspector hesitated. "You're suggesting she was framed?" "No," Miss Marple replied slowly. "I believe she killed Mr. Fenimore, but I no longer think it was for the reason we assumed." He frowned. "Go on. Have you spoken to the housekeeper?" Grange Hollow didn't have one. "But it did," Miss Marple said softly. "Mrs. Broadmoor. She came in twice a week, quietly through the back. She didn't speak at the gathering. She wasn't on the guest list. She's not been interviewed." The inspector sat forward. "How do you know that?" "I saw her leaving the rear gate the morning of the murder. She carries a brown handbag stitched with a pansy on one side. Quite distinctive. I recognised it at once. I gave her that very bag in 1947 as a raffle prize at the parish fete. I remember because she won it 3 years running and was terribly embarrassed." The inspector blinked, then reached for his notebook. "She may have seen something," Miss Marple continued. "And I'd wager she's still in the village. She always winters with her sister over on Dunmere Lane." An hour later, they found Mrs. Broadmoor precisely where Miss Marple had predicted, feeding birds in a coat older than the Queen's reign, and with spectacles thick as stained glass. At first, she was reluctant. She hadn't wanted trouble, but eventually she confessed. She had gone in early that morning to light the kitchen hearth. Miss Dandridge, or whoever she is, never stirred. The upstairs was quiet, but I noticed the front door had been left open a crack, not wide, just enough to let in the cold. "And the window?" Bremer asked. "Oh, that wasn't broken yet," she said firmly. "I always dust the library shelves first, and nothing was amiss. No glass on the rug." A silence fell. The window had been broken after the murder. The timeline shifted. Back at the station, Miss Marple requested one more look at the items collected from the scene. Photographs, clothing, a crumpled party invitation, and a small object that had been dismissed, a faded Christmas card lying in the library hearth, partially burned. The inspector had set it aside as an accident, a casualty of the fire. She picked it up with tweezers, examining it through her spectacles. On the front was an embossed robin. Inside, the handwriting was old-fashioned, looping. "To A.F. with fondness always." From E.D., but Miss Marple frowned. "No," she whispered, "not E.D." The D in the signature was a looped O, a habit she had seen before, in old diaries written by Eleanor Dandridge, the real Eliza's mother. The card wasn't from Eliza at all. It was from Eleanor, and it was dated December 24th, 1997, over 30 years ago. "Inspector," she said, turning slowly, "this card was not placed in the hearth by accident. It was meant to burn. Someone wanted it gone. You think it's a clue?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice turning crisp, "that Arthur Fenimore was not killed because he discovered the impostor. He was killed because he knew something older, something buried deep in the past of this family." She paced gently, hands clasped behind her back. "He received this card once, long ago, from Eleanor. Why keep it for 30 years? Unless the fondness meant something more." Bremer stared. "Are you saying they were lovers? Perhaps. Or perhaps Arthur was more than a friend. A father, maybe. A secret one. It was only a theory, but it stirred something long buried. Fenimore had always remained close to the Dandridge family, long after the father had died in a hunting accident. He'd never married. He'd never left the village. Miss Marple requested the old birth records, and sure enough, the line for Eliza Dandridge listed no father, only a mother, Eleanor. But more than that, it revealed a time discrepancy. Eliza had been born in April, not July, as stated in the false records held by the solicitor. The real Eliza had died, but not when people believed. The timelines had been tampered with, and only 2 people had access to those documents before the supposed Eliza's return, the imposter and Mr. Silas Trent. Another clever puzzle, Miss Marple said with a sigh. They brought Silas Trent in that afternoon. At first, he was composed, but when the name Eleanor Dandridge was mentioned, his calm shattered. "She promised to keep it secret," he hissed. "I kept it all these years. I protected that child." When Fenimore started asking questions, again, going through the old letters, I warned him. He wouldn't stop. So I told her. Told the girl he was a threat. She said she would handle it. I didn't ask how. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "You say she handled it. But it was you who broke the window after the fact, wasn't it? To make it look like a robbery." He didn't deny it. The imposter had come to Little Withering not to steal wealth, but to protect something deeper, a family truth long buried. Her loyalty wasn't to herself, but to Eleanor Dandridge. She had been raised in secret by Eleanor's sister, and she had sworn to preserve the honour of a woman long dead. Miss Marple sat quietly that evening, watching the fire flicker in the hearth at the vicarage. Outside, the bells rang faintly across the snow-covered valley, and the village settled into the hush of another winter night. It had not been a simple case, nor a tidy one, but truth, she knew, was rarely tidy, and sometimes the only thing more complex than murder was family. The storm began to ease on Christmas Eve, the heavy snow shifting into a fine powder that danced in the air like ash. Though Grange Hollow remained shuttered, the echoes of the crime there had spread far beyond its frost-covered gates. In the village, at the grocer's and the post office, people speculated, whispered, and watched their neighbours with new caution. The return of a dead girl, a false identity, a murder committed in a locked room. It was the sort of thing that might have belonged in a penny dreadful, not quiet Little Withering. Miss Marple, however, was not concerned with gossip. She knew all too well that truth lay buried not in drama or conjecture, but in the small, subtle shifts in a person's voice, the tightening of a mouth, the pause before a simple answer. She had requested, quite gently, that Inspector Bremer arrange a second round of interviews, not with the imposter now behind bars or with Silas Trent, whose guilt in tampering with the scene was evident, but with the others, those who had attended the gathering that night at Grange Hollow. Each of them had something more to say, or something to hide. They began with Reverend Elliot and his wife, Margaret. The couple arrived together at the station, bundled in matching overcoats and carrying a tin of fruitcake wrapped in ribbon as though it were still a social call. "It's a dreadful thing," Margaret began at once. "So many lies, so much blood. I still can't believe that wasn't Eliza." "It's unsettling, yes," Elliot said, his hands clasped. "She looks so much like Eleanor, the same way of moving, the same careful speech. I dare say if anyone were to impersonate her, they chose the right person." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And how well did you know Eliza before she left?" "Not very," Margaret said. "She was shy, withdrawn even as a child." "Quiet," Elliot echoed. "Unnaturally so. I remember once, during Sunday, school, the other children were whispering about ghosts. Eliza sat perfectly still and said, 'Ghosts don't walk in the open, they sit in empty chairs and say nothing at all.' Gave me chills." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you saw nothing unusual at the gathering?" The Reverend looked to his wife, then back. "We left just after 10. Miss Colcombe offered us a ride down the hill. It was a pleasant evening. No raised voices. Arthur was in high spirits. A bit drunk, perhaps." Margaret pursed her lips. "He was laughing too loud. I remember thinking he would spill his port, and he kept looking at her, at Eliza, I mean, as if seeing her for the first time." "But he knew her as a child," Miss Marple said. "Surely he would have recognised her." Margaret hesitated. "He said something odd when we were putting on our coats. I didn't think much of it then." "What was it?" "He said, 'I'm not sure that's the girl I remember, but I'm sure I'll find out soon enough.'" Miss Marple folded her hands, the words echoing in her mind like a loose floorboard. She made a note and moved on. Miss Colcombe, the former governess, came next. She arrived alone, her coat buttoned high and her gloves perfectly clean, as though she had scrubbed away the murder with bleach and brass polish. She was always a lonely child, she said, settling into the station chair. Loved the silence of the house. Eleanor spoiled her terribly. You mean the real Eliza? Bremer asked. I mean the girl who died, Miss Colcombe said firmly. Whoever that woman was, she had Eleanor's voice but not Eliza's heart. Miss Marple smiled politely. And yet you didn't suspect anything during the evening? No, the governess admitted. She had the eyes, you see. Eyes like black mirrors. She watched everything. Just like Eliza. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did you speak with Mr. Fenimore that evening? I avoided him, truth be told. I never liked Arthur. He always called me Old Crow behind my back. And I knew he wanted to sell the house, cut it up into flats. He thought sentiment was a weakness, but that house was built on memory. There was something defensive in her tone, too sharp to ignore. Bremer asked, Did you leave with the Elliots, as they said? Number I walked, said my goodbyes, and went out through the side. I wanted the air. Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. But Margaret said you offered them a ride. Miss Colcombe blinked. I did? Oh, well, I must have changed my mind. I walk most evenings. She left shortly after, flustered. Miss Marple made another note. One contradiction. Small, but telling. The last of the guests was Mr. Fenimore's hunting companion, Arthur's closest remaining friend, Mr. Gavin Keane. A quiet man with a coarse coat and a thick moustache, he had been the only one who hadn't spoken publicly since the murder. Now, sitting across from Miss Marple, he fidgeted with his hat. I didn't want to come that night, he said, eyes low. Arthur insisted, said he had something to settle. Did he say what? Number only that it concerned old ghosts and new faces. Miss Marple watched him closely. Did he seem agitated? Keane shrugged. He was always agitated in his own way, always chasing some cause. But that night, yes, I suppose he was more serious than usual. I thought maybe it had to do with Eleanor. Eleanor? Keane nodded slowly. He never stopped loving her. Not really, I think. I think that's why he stayed in this damn village after she died, watching from the edges. Bremer asked, Did he ever say he was Eliza's father? No, Keane said with finality. And if he knew he was, he kept it to himself. But he carried a photo of her as a baby in his wallet. I saw it once when he dropped it. Miss Marple leaned back slightly. And what about the girl that night? Did you recognize her? Keane hesitated. I recognized the resemblance, but there was something wrong. She was too confident. Eliza never looked anyone in the eye when she was a girl. This one stared straight through you. Yet you said nothing. What was I supposed to say? Arthur wanted answers. I was there to watch his back. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, you left before him. Keane nodded. He told me to go. Said he had what he needed. Said he'd see me in the morning. He did not. When the interviews ended, Miss Marple and Inspector Bremer sat in silence reviewing their notes. Each story painted a similar evening, music, wine, small talk. But in the cracks, contradictions began to form. Miss Colcombe claimed to walk home alone, but others placed her at the car. Margaret remembered words Arthur had spoken that suggested doubt. Gavin Keane had known more than he let on, more than most about Arthur's motivations, and most interestingly, no one could account for 20 minutes between 10 and 10:30, the period in which the front door had been opened, the fire had begun to die, and the library had fallen silent. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the paper. Voices, she said softly. What? They all told the same story, but every one of them used her voice to tell it, her eyes, her behaviour, her way of speaking. Even the people who believed she wasn't Eliza described her just as those who did. You think they were rehearsed? No, she said. I think they were all watching her, not each other. And in that gap, the lies took root. She looked out the window again, where frost veined the panes and the village beyond lay still. Somewhere beneath those overlapping stories, the true shape of the night waited, and she intended to find it. The village of Little Withering remained draped in winter's hush, but the peace was deceptive. In drawing rooms and kitchens, curtains were drawn, tighter than usual. Phone calls ended mid-sentence, and neighbours avoided eye contact in the post office queue. The murder at Grange Hollow had unsettled the very marrow of the village, and behind every polite smile now loomed a question. Who had known what, and for how long? At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat by the hearth with her knitting untouched in her lap, the needles motionless. A fresh pot of tea steamed beside her, ignored. Her mind was not with wool or stitches. It was inside Grange Hollow, inside the darkened library where a man had died, not for money nor madness, but something far older and far colder. Secrets. Inspector Bremer had returned to the station to sift through more files, and Miss Marple, in his absence, began laying out the pieces once again. The truth was close. She could feel it in her bones, but every time she reached for it, the motives blurred together like frost on glass. They all had something to gain. Silas Trent, the solicitor, had perhaps the most obvious reason: self-preservation. He had helped the impostor obtain forged documentation and altered the family trust records, likely for a price. His initial claim of protecting the Dandridge legacy was undermined by the quiet but damning discovery that he had recently purchased a second cottage in Sussex under a false name. Miss Marple had made a discreet inquiry and found that it had been paid in full, in cash. Blood money, perhaps. Yet he had not been the killer. Of that Miss Marple was certain. He was clever in his way, but not brave. Tampering with documents was one thing. Murder was quite another. Then there was Miss Colcombe, the loyal governess, protector of the Dandridge name. She had shown more emotion than expected in her second interview, and Miss Marple had noted the tremble in her hand when the baby photo of Eliza was mentioned. Had she known the child that came back was an impostor? More intriguingly, had she been complicit? She had no fortune of her own, no family, no prospects. Miss Marple had seen the way she looked at the Hollow, not as a place, but as a purpose. Perhaps helping someone impersonate Eliza was her way of keeping that purpose alive. She may even have believed it was right. Yet again, she lacked the nerve. Miss Marple remembered an incident in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Harper's canary had gone missing, and Miss Colcombe had been too shaken to even speak of it when visiting. Not the constitution of a killer. Gavin Keane. Ah, now he was a different story. He had every reason to hate Arthur Fenimore. Not just jealousy, though there was likely plenty of that. Arthur had always been the louder one, the bolder one, favoured by Eleanor Dandridge, if rumours from years past were true. Gavin had remained in Arthur's shadow, faithful but unnoticed. But it was what he'd said about the photograph that stuck in Miss Marple's mind. The one of baby Eliza that Arthur supposedly carried. How had he seen it, unless he had gone through Arthur's belongings or confronted him? Could Gavin have been Eliza's real father? Or worse, did he believe he was? That kind of grief, rotting away for years in silence, could ferment into something bitter and final, especially when Arthur announced that he had uncovered the truth and intended to act on it. A man like Gavin, quiet, forgotten, capable, might very well have decided that if he couldn't be the father, then no one could. And yet, Margaret Elliot, the Reverend's wife, so quick to offer her account, so helpful, too helpful. It was she who'd repeated Arthur's cryptic words, "I'm not sure that's the girl I remember." And yet, when Miss Marple checked with the Reverend later, he couldn't recall Arthur saying any such thing. In fact, Reverend Elliot remembered only Arthur talking about the house, not the girl at all. Margaret had inserted that phrase. Why? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Margaret had been a close friend of Eleanor's. They had grown up together in the village, gone to the same church socials, and been bridesmaids at each other's weddings. There were photos to prove it, in the parish scrapbook Miss Marple had asked to see. What if Margaret had known about Eleanor's secret? And what if she had passed that knowledge to her husband's parishioners, offering gentle guidance, shaping how people remembered Eliza? There was no monetary motive there, but there was something more powerful: control, the illusion of a perfect past. Perhaps Margaret, in her own way, had helped the impostor settle in, not for gain, but to preserve the myth of the Dandridge name, the respectable story of an old family kept intact. But none of this explained the murder itself. Not entirely. No single motive stretched cleanly across the web. Each thread frayed. Each person wore their truth like a mask, hiding behind sorrow, nostalgia, or righteousness. The impostor had not acted alone. That much was clear, but the motive was too entangled to name. Then Miss Marple remembered something that tugged at her mind like a loose thread. The card. The burned Christmas card in the hearth addressed to Arthur Fenimore, signed E.D. Why had the impostor tried to destroy it? Miss Marple fetched her notes and studied the scan again. The signature was looped, yes, but the handwriting itself, elegant, slightly slanted to the left, did not match Eleanor's writing in the birth certificate, nor the labels on old Dandridge photographs. It was someone else's entirely. She returned to the station to request another handwriting comparison, this time not from the Dandridge estate, but from parish records. Margaret Elliot had kept all the Christmas guest logs for the last 20 years. Miss Marple had seen them herself, and the signature from 2 years prior, Margaret Elliot, Grange Hollow, warmest thanks, matched the card in the hearth. Margaret had written the card, to Arthur, signed with Eleanor's initials, which meant she had pretended to be Eleanor. Why? Miss Marple began to see it now, the shape of something cold and long hidden, a secret love, a betrayal, a cover-up. Margaret had always resented Eleanor, envied her wealth, her charm, her freedom. When Eleanor fell pregnant without naming the father, Margaret had stepped in to help. But she did more than that. She manipulated the story. She told Arthur the child was his. Perhaps it was. Perhaps not. But that lie bound him to the family, made him stay, made him trust her. Years later, when Arthur began to suspect the truth, that he had been lied to, that he was never Eliza's father at all, he must have confronted Margaret. And Margaret, desperate to keep the old lie buried, told the impostor everything, that Arthur was a threat, that he would destroy her, that the story she had built of Eliza, of Grange Hollow, of their perfect village, was unravelling. So the impostor killed him. But Margaret had handed her the knife, and behind it all stood a web of motives, each twisted around the other. Silas for greed, Colcombe for loyalty, Keene for jealousy, and Margaret for the preservation of her fiction. Miss Marple folded her notebook with a sigh. The motive wasn't singular, she said softly. It was communal, a murder by permission. She rang for Inspector Bremer. It was time, she thought, to confront the woman who had helped pull the strings. With gloved hands. The snow had stopped, but the gloom remained. Inspector Morton stood proudly at the front of the drawing room, his coat dusted with melting frost, his fingers wrapped tightly around a thin file as if it were the key to all things. The rest of the family stood gathered. Lady Evelyn, Mr. Warwick, timid Imogen, and even the brooding housekeeper, Mrs. Kit. A nervous energy vibrated through the room, like the stillness before a second thunderclap. "I've brought you all here because we've made progress," Morton announced, savouring the drama of his own voice. Substantial progress. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fire, was knitting. Her needles clinked gently, unfazed. She didn't look up, but her fingers paused for the first time since the inspector began speaking. Morton opened the file and revealed a photograph. This was recovered from the cottage 2 miles down the hill, the one rented under a false name last month. Inside we found traces of blood, tested and matched to the victim. And this, he lifted a scarf, a woman's, faintly perfumed, belongs to Miss Imogen, as confirmed by the maid. A gasp swept the room. Imogen, who had been clutching her arms across her chest, swayed as if someone had struck her. "No," she whispered. "I lost that scarf weeks ago. Anyone could have." The scarf, the blood, and, most importantly, the letter. Morton raised a final slip of paper. A torn half of the missing note left in Mr. Ellison's study. The handwriting matches Imogen's. "Precisely." Lady Evelyn turned to her niece, her mouth agape. "Imogen? But why? I didn't. That letter wasn't mine. I've never even been to that cottage." "You admit the scarf is yours," Morton said, voice steely. "I do, but I swear it was gone. Taken from my room." Miss Marple's needles clicked once more, then stopped. She finally looked up. "How curious," she said softly, "that the scarf was discovered only after Mr. Ellison's blood had stained it." Morton gave her a sharp look. "Do you suggest we planted it, Miss Marple?" "Oh no, dear. Merely that the order of things matters greatly when one is composing a false narrative." Warwick stepped forward now. "I knew she was hiding something, always slipping away for her walks. You said you liked to get fresh air. You never mentioned a cottage." "I didn't—" Imogen's voice broke, her hands trembling. "I swear it." Morton straightened. "I think we have enough. We'll need you to come with us, Miss Ellison." But even as the young woman was led from the room, Miss Marple didn't return to her knitting. She merely stared at the fireplace, lost in quiet thought. That evening, the manor was suffocatingly still. Dinner was a dry, silent affair. Evelyn picked at her lamb and said little. Warwick drank more than he should have. Marple watched, quietly noting who avoided whose gaze. Later, as the house settled into uneasy slumber, she found Warwick alone in the billiard room, hands on the cue, lining up shots he didn't intend to take. "Clever boy," she said softly. He turned. "What?" "Oh, not about the murder, dear. About the scarf." His face froze, just long enough to confirm her suspicions. "You gave it to the inspector yourself, didn't you?" she asked gently. A helpful tip. An anonymous letter, perhaps. He never mentioned how he found the cottage, just that he did. "You're imagining things." She stepped closer. "Number, I think you knew where that scarf was, because you took it from her weeks ago, on one of your walks." "That's absurd, is it? You said you didn't know the victim well, but I've checked. You worked at the same firm before he disappeared. You left shortly after." "Why?" He dropped the cue. "You've no proof." "I don't need it. Not yet. But something doesn't sit right, and the truth always bubbles up, no matter how thick the ice." She left him standing in silence, his knuckles white against the green felt table. The next morning, Imogen was gone. Inspector Morton had taken her back to town for questioning. The family awoke to an odd stillness, as though the manor itself was holding its breath. Marple made her way to the servants' quarters, where she found Mrs. Kit hanging linens. "Busy morning," the old housekeeper muttered, not looking up. "Indeed," said Marple, "though I'd imagine it's no more difficult than the day Master Henry was sent away." Mrs. Kit's hands froze. "You were here then," Marple continued. "I believe you watched a boy pack his things and disappear without a word. And yet, you never mentioned that you knew the victim was Henry Ellison." "I didn't." "You did. You called him that lad when you first saw his photo. Not the poor man, not the victim. You recognized him." Mrs. Kit finally turned, face pale and stiff. "He shouldn't have come back. Not after what happened." "What did happen?" asked Marple. Kit's lips tightened. "He was trouble, always sneaking about. Lady Evelyn tried to fix it, paid him to go, but he came back for more. Said he had rights." "Rights?" Marple asked. "To what?" "To the house. To the name." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "Ah, so he threatened the inheritance." "Aye," Kit said, voice low. "Said if Evelyn didn't recognise him, he'd go to the papers. Said he had proof of who he really was. He was her husband's by blood." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing this. "So, he came home for Christmas, and someone made sure he didn't leave." Kit stared at her for a long moment. But it wasn't Imogen. "No," said Miss Marple, turning back toward the hall. "No, I don't believe it was." The false victory was beginning to crumble. The inspector had acted swiftly, too swiftly. Evidence had emerged too conveniently. And now, with a missing scarf, a supposedly incriminating note, and a long-buried family scandal, the puzzle was shifting underfoot. But somewhere, the real killer was still watching, and Miss Marple could feel it, like a chill that never quite left the room. The chill of early morning seeped through the windows of the vicarage, casting long shadows over Miss Marple's worn notebook, as she traced a delicate line beneath a scribbled note. The fire was nothing but a smouldering pile of ash, and outside, the village of Little Withering still lay in quiet, frost-glazed slumber. Yet within that stillness, a whisper of something long forgotten had stirred. A thread that, once pulled, threatened to unravel everything. For hours, Miss Marple had been sifting through old parish records and local newspaper clippings, a task she had begun on a whim after the unexpected developments in the case. Among the brittle pages and yellowed ink, she found an article dated nearly 50 years prior, a brief report on the disappearance of a young woman named Helen Pritchard, a cousin of the Dandridge family, who vanished without a trace just days before Christmas. The case had gone cold, dismissed by the police as a runaway, but something in the wording caught her eye. Helen had last been seen at Grange Hollow, attending a holiday gathering very much like the one that had just ended in tragedy. Her name was mentioned alongside Arthur Fenimore, who had apparently been her confidant. The article spoke of a family feud, jealousies, and whispered scandals involving inheritance disputes and secret romances. But the most striking detail was a mention of a faded letter, an unsigned note found in Helen's room, hinting at a revelation that would change everything. Miss Marple's mind raced. Could this forgotten mystery be the key to the present crime? Had Arthur Fenimore's murder been more than a desperate act to conceal a forged identity? Was it instead a continuation of a dark chapter written decades before? She summoned Inspector Bremer and requested access to the full archive of the Dandridge family's legal and personal correspondence, papers that had been stored in the solicitor's office and largely overlooked in the recent investigation. As they pored over the documents, a pattern began to emerge. Letters exchanged between Eleanor Dandridge and a man named Thomas Pritchard, Helen's father, revealed a secret alliance. They spoke in coded language about protecting the family name and keeping certain truths hidden. One letter alluded to a child born out of wedlock, raised in secrecy, whose existence could threaten the entire Dandridge legacy. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she turned to a fragile photograph tucked within an envelope, a picture of a young woman bearing an uncanny resemblance to the imposter now in custody. The handwriting on the back read simply, "For your protection, until the time is right." Suddenly, everything clicked. The imposter had not arrived in Little Withering by chance. She had been sent to guard a secret that spanned generations. Her connection to the family ran deeper than anyone had suspected. But the real shock came when Miss Marple cross-referenced the old case files with recent interviews. A name repeatedly surfaced in both past and present: Silas Trent, the solicitor. His family had long-standing ties to the Dandridges, and his grandfather had been involved in the handling of Helen Pritchard's disappearance. Further inquiry revealed that Silas had inherited not only his grandfather's legal practice, but also a burden of silence. He had been the unseen guardian of the family's darkest secrets, wielding his knowledge as quietly and effectively as a knife. Miss Marple confronted Silas once more. His composure cracked as she laid out the connections. "You knew about Helen Pritchard," she said softly. "You knew about the child hidden away. You helped forge records and identities to protect that secret." He nodded, defeated. "It was never meant to harm anyone, just to keep the family whole." "But it did," she said. "Arthur Fenimore discovered the truth, and someone decided that was too dangerous." As Silas fell silent, Miss Marple realized that the murder was not merely about the impostor's deceit or a greed-fueled inheritance scheme. It was about fear, the fear of a past that refused to stay buried and the lengths people would go to preserve illusions. The shadows of the past had reached across decades to cast a long, dark silhouette over Grange Hollow, and only by unravelling these old wounds could the truth finally come to light. Miss Marple stood silently in the dimly lit parlour of Grange Hollow, the late afternoon sun casting long, waning shadows across the faded wallpaper and polished wood. The room still held the faint scent of old books and worn leather, a scent that somehow seemed to cling to the secrets woven into the very fabric of the house. The storm outside had cleared, but an icy tension hung heavy within these walls. She had invited the remaining suspects to the house, not as a formal interrogation, but as a gathering under the guise of reminiscing about the late Arthur Fenimore. Her plan was simple, yet unorthodox. A test of character, played like a quiet game of chess. Miss Marple had long observed that people who lie tend to give themselves away, not by what they say, but how they respond when confronted with the truth hidden behind carefully worded questions. As the guests took their seats around the hearth, Silas Trent, Miss Colcombe, Gavin Keane and Margaret Elliot, Miss Marple poured each a cup of tea, watching their faces with careful eyes. The impostor remained confined under lock and key. Tonight was for those who remained free but whose roles in the story were far from clear. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began gently. I thought it fitting we remember Mr. Fenimore in a place he loved. This house holds many memories, some pleasant, some less so. The group nodded uneasily. The governess, Miss Colcombe, adjusted her scarf, her gaze flitting nervously to the fireplace. Silas Trent sipped his tea with a careful precision, while Gavin Keane seemed lost in thought, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on his knee. Margaret Elliot watched everyone with a steady, unreadable gaze. Miss Marple set her cup down and reached into her handbag, producing a small box. Before we begin, I want to share something rather curious. A Christmas card that was found partially burned in the hearth. It bears a signature from years past, a message of fondness and secrecy. It seems to have stirred much in our village. She paused, watching the faces around her. Now, she said, I've devised a small exercise, one of observation, not accusation. I want each of you to consider what you would say to Mr. Fenimore, were he here. Something you never said, or perhaps something you wish you had. And I ask that you speak from the heart, no matter how difficult. There was a silence, thick and expectant. Silas Trent was the first to break it. Mr. Fenimore was a man burdened by loyalty and regret. I wish I had been braver to challenge him, to tell him that some secrets are better left buried. Miss Colcombe's voice trembled next. I loved him, in a way. He was the only one who saw me, not just as a governess, but as a person. I wish I had told him to leave the past behind. Gavin Keane hesitated, then spoke with a quiet bitterness. Arthur was stubborn, always chasing ghosts and lies. I wish I'd told him to let go, but I feared what might happen if he did. Margaret Elliot was last, her lips pressed tightly together. She took a deep breath, then said slowly, I wish I had told him the truth. All of it, but some truths are too dangerous. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Margaret, then back to the group. Thank you. Now, I want to share an observation. When the card was discovered, there was a subtle mark, barely noticeable, on the back, a faint scent of lavender. She watched closely as the four exchanged glances. Lavender, Miss Marple repeated softly, a scent often associated with care and concealment, and yet only one among you is known to favour lavender. Margaret's hand twitched, her composure flickering for the briefest moment. A bead of sweat appeared at her temple. Miss Elliot, Miss Marple said gently, you spoke of truths being dangerous. Perhaps more dangerous than you intended? Margaret swallowed hard but did not speak. Tell me, Miss Marple continued, when was the last time you visited Grange Hollow unannounced? Margaret's eyes darted to the window, then back. I might have dropped by to leave a message. A message? Miss Marple's voice was steady. To whom? To the lady of the house, Margaret admitted reluctantly. And what was in the message? Margaret hesitated, then whispered, A warning, Miss Marple smiled faintly. And warnings can take many forms, some written, some spoken, some left burning in a hearth. The room seemed to close in around Margaret. Her mask cracked. You fear the past unravelling, Miss Marple said, because you know what will be exposed. Margaret's shoulders slumped. Yes, I did not kill Arthur, she confessed, but I wish to protect us all from the shame, from the ruin. Silas Trent cleared his throat. And what of the others? Who will bear the blame if not the woman who held the family's secrets? Miss Marple looked at each face in turn, then said quietly, The truth is not something to be feared. It is something to be understood. The subtle cracks had begun to widen, and though the full picture was still obscured, the unusual tactic had forced a veil to lift, just enough to glimpse the shapes beneath. Outside, the light faded, and the shadows grew longer. The game was far from over. The morning mist clung to the eaves of Grange Hollow as Miss Marple arrived, the sharp crunch of her boots on frozen gravel echoing softly in the stillness. The manor, once a stately symbol of tradition and secrets, now felt like a trap, a cage holding its last desperate whispers. She'd come early, intent on reviewing the evidence herself before the day's questioning began. In the library, the air was cold and dry, the heavy curtains drawn against the weak winter sun. The room held the remnants of last night's fire, ashes scattered, a faint odour of smoke lingering like a memory. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room methodically, retracing her steps to where the charred Christmas card had been found. It was gone. Her breath caught. The small brass box on the mantel, which held the other half of the torn note, the one that had connected so many pieces, was missing too. She moved toward the desk, now cleared of all papers, save a few haphazard notes that appeared hastily tossed aside. The neat pile of correspondence she had examined only days before was scattered, some letters crumpled, others torn. A faint smudge of ink marred the surface. Someone had been here. Her heart quickened, but her expression remained calm. The front door creaked behind her, and she turned to see Inspector Bremer entering, his face pale. "They're gone," he said simply. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "The note, the card, the box, all vanished overnight." Bremer frowned. "Do you think this is sabotage?" "I do," she said. "Someone is determined to bury the truth before it can surface." They exchanged a look that held the weight of unspoken fears. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fireplace. The hearth still held faint scorch marks, but no ash from new fires. Whoever had removed the card had done so with care, almost reverence. It wasn't an act of rage, she mused, more of desperation. Bremer nodded. "We've already seen enough signs that the killer has close knowledge of the house." "Close, yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but also bold. Removing evidence under the nose of the law is a risk. Whoever did this feels confident." The room felt suddenly colder. Bremer added, "We'll increase patrols and secure the house. No one comes in or out without our knowledge." Miss Marple's eyes stayed on the empty mantel. "We must consider who benefits most from silence. The answers lie not only in what's missing, but in who had the opportunity." Later, as they reviewed the list of visitors and staff, a troubling pattern emerged. A small gap in the watch logs, the night before the evidence vanished, showed a brief absence of surveillance near the library entrance. During that time, only 2 people had keys, Silas Trent and Mrs. Kitt, the housekeeper. Miss Marple frowned at the thought. "Mrs. Kitt has served the family for decades," Bremer noted. "Loyal to a fault." "Loyalty can take many forms," Miss Marple replied. "Sometimes it is loyalty to a person, sometimes to a secret." The housekeeper was summoned to the station. She arrived composed, but with eyes that flickered nervously as the missing items were described. "Did you see anyone near the library last night?" Bremer asked. "No, Inspector. I was in my quarters, preparing for the morning." "But—" her voice faltered. There was a strange sound, a soft shuffling, like paper being moved. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did it seem urgent? Hasty?" Mrs. Kitt hesitated. "Yes, but it stopped quickly, as if someone was afraid of being caught." "And did you recognize anyone's footsteps?" Bremer asked. Number 2 muffled. Miss Marple considered the housekeeper's words carefully. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the past days? Strange visitors? Unfamiliar voices?" Mrs. Kitt shook her head. "Only that Miss Colcombe has been restless, pacing the halls at odd hours." "Did she have access to the library?" "Yes, she has the key, as part of her duties." A knot tightened in Miss Marple's chest. That evening she approached Miss Colcombe, who was sitting alone in the drawing-room, fingers intertwined tightly. "Miss Colcombe," Miss Marple began gently, "have you been in the library recently?" The governess looked up, startled. "Only to tidy and prepare for visitors. Did you see anything missing or out of place?" "No," she said firmly, "but if something were gone—" "Would you be surprised?" Miss Marple asked softly. The governess hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Miss Marple's gaze searched the woman's face for a flicker of truth. "It is difficult," Miss Colcombe whispered, "to serve a family with so many secrets. Sometimes I wonder if the house itself keeps its own counsel." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and sometimes those secrets are too heavy for one to bear." As the night deepened, the tension in Grange Hollow thickened like fog. The vanished evidence was more than a theft. It was a message. Someone was warning Miss Marple and the authorities to stop digging. Yet the detective felt no fear. Instead, a quiet resolve settled within her. For every shadow cast, there was light waiting to be found. and though the clues had been stolen, the truth was still alive, hidden in the spaces between silence and deception, waiting to be uncovered. Snow fell hard over the village of Much Dithering that night, blanketing every rooftop and hedgerow in a mute white shroud. It had a peculiar way of making things feel hushed, like a stage being set for something inevitable. Inside the vicarage, however, nothing felt still. Constable Reed had just taken the call when the door burst open, letting in a flurry of snow and a wild-eyed cook from the Red Hearth Inn. "Miss Marple, it's happened again," the woman gasped, clutching the doorframe. "Young Mr. Harold Linton. He's been found dead in the snow, outside the old greenhouse behind the Willoughby estate." A silence followed, brittle and heavy. Marple rose slowly from the hearthside chair where she had been darning a glove. She placed her knitting aside with calm fingers, but her eyes were sharp. "Is he quite? Certainly dead?" Constable Reed nodded grimly. "Yes. Blunt force trauma, they think. Same estate, just behind the main house, no sign of struggle. And oddest of all, he still had the envelope I'd given him. Yesterday. The one he was meant to take to the station." A stillness settled in the room, and Miss Marple's expression seemed to freeze with it. "Then the killer knew," she said, "what Harold had, and followed him." She didn't need to say what the rest were already thinking. Someone in the village, someone close to this affair, was panicking. The Willoughby estate, again bathed in police lanterns, took on a ghostlier hue that night. It looked abandoned despite the presence of people. A second murder in as many days sent waves of fear through the villagers. This wasn't a crime of opportunity anymore. It was a campaign. Calculated. Desperate. Harold's body had been found lying against a patch of shattered glass in the snow, part of the broken greenhouse wall. His coat was pulled up, as though he'd tried to shield his head. Marple examined the body gently, her breath white in the air. "Who found him?" she asked. "Mrs. Merriweather," said Reed. "Said she came to pick sprigs of holly for her mantle. Found him just there," she said, barely visible in the snow. Mrs. Merriweather again, the same woman who had found the original scene of Frederick's death. The one who always seemed to stumble upon things just moments before anyone else. Miss Marple rose from her knees. "I think, dear Constable, we must stop thinking of this as one crime, and start seeing it as a pattern." He furrowed his brow. "A pattern?" "Yes. 2 murders in such short succession. One victim whose return surprised everyone, and another who was trying to remove evidence from the scene." They walked a little from the body. Marple motioned him closer. "It seems to me, Mr. Reed, that Harold must have known something he didn't say. Something that frightened him enough to try slipping it away from here quietly. Only, someone knew he had it. But the envelope is still there, untouched." "That's just it," she said softly. "It was a distraction. That envelope, whatever it contained, was a decoy. The killer didn't care about it. They cared what else Harold might say." They turned as Doctor. Mortimer approached, brushing snow from his coat. "Confirmed blunt trauma. Likely struck with something heavy and blunt. Again. This time, though, I did find something odd. Looked like a faded bit of wax stuck to the inside of his glove. Red, like an old wax seal." Reed looked puzzled. "Wax seal?" Miss Marple's lips drew into a line. "From a letter, perhaps, or from something far older." And then slowly her expression changed. "Has anyone searched the attic?" The attic of the Willoughby estate was a cavernous space, filled with the scent of dry timber and the dust of forgotten years. Old trunks lined the walls. Reed and Marple moved carefully, their lantern casting long shadows across cobwebs and shrouded furniture. "Here," she said, pointing to a small locked cabinet tucked behind an old wardrobe. Reed jimmied it open with a small crowbar. Inside was a stack of old letters, yellowing with age, tied with a red silk ribbon. Miss Marple gently opened one. Her eyes narrowed. They were letters from Eliza Willoughby, Frederick's mother, written to a man named John Bletchley. The tone was tender, confessional. "They had an affair," Marple whispered, "but that's not all." She held up another sheet, a birth certificate. It bore the name Harold Bletchley. "Dear Lord," Reed breathed. Harold was Frederick's half-brother. Marple nodded. "Which explains everything. Why Harold left the village so suddenly as a young man. Why he returned after Frederick's death. He must have learned of the connection and come back to claim his place, or at least to understand it. But someone else already knew. Someone who stood to lose everything if the truth emerged. By dawn, the storm had passed. The Willoughby household was still, save for the few remaining officers guarding the property. Marple, however, was wide awake, seated quietly beside the parlour window, her tea going cold. A light creaked on the stairs. Down came Margaret Willoughby, pale and composed. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Of course not," said Miss Marple. "Grief can do that, as can guilt." Margaret stood very still. Marple didn't turn from the window. "You see, I believe it wasn't just the family name you were protecting, Margaret. You were protecting your son." Margaret's breath caught. "You can't possibly know that." "I don't know all of it," she admitted. "But I know enough. I know Harold found proof he was Eliza's son, which meant, legally or not, he might have laid claim to a part of the estate. Or worse, he might have exposed affairs and betrayals that would ruin the Willoughby name. And you couldn't allow that, not with your son Edward being prepared for a title." A future Margaret's hand trembled on the banister. "You have no proof," Miss Marple finally turned. "I think I do. That wax seal Dr. Mortimer found, there's only one such seal still in use by a family member, on the Willoughby family ring, which you wear." There was a long pause. "I only meant to frighten him," Margaret whispered. "Harold was brash and angry. I thought if he left again it would all go back to quiet. But he wouldn't leave, not after he found those letters." "And Frederick?" Marple asked gently. Margaret's face crumpled. "Frederick knew. He tried to stop me. He tried to reason with Harold. And when I found them arguing, I thought I had to end it before either said anything." The confession was quiet, almost defeated. Snowflakes still drifted outside, delicate and harmless. Miss Marple rose, placing a hand softly on the woman's shoulder. "The past always finds a way to speak, my dear, and the truth never stays buried long, not even beneath. Snow!" Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting pale gold across the frost-bitten earth. The storm had passed, but its scars would remain. It was during a rare moment of quiet that Miss Marple found herself seated once again in the drawing-room, alone, surrounded by the collected artefacts of the Ashcroft family's peculiar legacy. Rain beat gently on the frost-glazed windows, and the ticking of the ancient clock on the mantel pulsed in rhythm with her thoughts. A fire crackled in the hearth, unattended, its warmth oddly at odds with the chill that clung to the edges of the mystery. She glanced once more at the collection of items arrayed on the low table before her. The photograph of young Daniel taken years ago, the crumpled Christmas card bearing Rupert's looping signature, the scorched remnants of the destroyed will. Her fingers brushed lightly against the brass button she had retrieved from the hedgerow, the same type found on Edward's overcoat. And then her eyes fell upon the hand-stitched cushion on the window seat. She rose, slowly, and crossed to it. The embroidery, festive holly and ivy, with the words "Home for Christmas" stitched in fading red, had long caught her eye, but she hadn't examined it closely until now. She turned it over. The date embroidered on the back was what startled her. December 25th, 2001. That was the year Daniel had vanished. Miss Marple felt the soft creak of the floorboards as someone stepped behind her. She turned to find Eleanor standing there, her arms folded tightly, her eyes hollow. "You made that, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, I made one every year. It was a way of hoping." "But this one is different," Miss Marple murmured. "It wasn't displayed with the others. This one you hid away." Eleanor swallowed hard. "It was the last one, the day Daniel disappeared." Marple turned the cushion over in her hands again, her brow creasing. "And yet, this was found in the window seat, a place where, if someone had hidden something inside, it would be overlooked. You used to keep secrets here as a girl, didn't you?" Eleanor said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. "Miss Eleanor," Marple said softly, "I believe you know more about what happened to Daniel than you've said." The woman's composure cracked just slightly. I didn't I didn't kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. I know, but someone close to you did, or you saw something that made no sense back then but does now. Eleanor's shoulders trembled. There was blood, she whispered, just a little, on the back steps. I told no one. I thought he'd run away like everyone said. But after Rupert died, I started to wonder. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. A pattern was emerging, all right. Not one formed by physical evidence alone, but by the emotional tapestry binding this family together. Regret, silence, guilt. She returned to the table and picked up the photograph again. Daniel as a boy, sunlight on his face, eyes full of hope. But it was the background that caught her attention now. A tree, gnarled and ancient, leaning slightly over a stone wall. That tree. It wasn't here anymore. It had been cut down some years back. Eleanor had mentioned that in passing. But where it once stood, just beyond the hedge near the north field, had now become the site of the small ornamental pond Rupert had installed shortly before his death. Miss Marple's mind clicked into motion. She left the drawing room with quiet determination and called for Inspector Cray. They needed to dig beneath that pond. It was early the next morning when the excavation began. The water was drained, the silt cleared, and there, beneath layers of blackened earth and rotted roots, they found the final resting place of a child. Daniel Ashcroft, wrapped in an oilskin coat, a faded red Christmas jumper still clinging to the bones. The house fell under a silence more profound than grief. Miss Marple stood beside the edge of the drained pond, her thoughts whirring faster than her age would suggest. There was still a killer among them, and now it was no longer only about Rupert's death, it was about Daniel's too. The clues had all been present, scattered like breadcrumbs behind veils of sorrow and time. The photo, the cushion, the tree, the blood, the will, all linked by a common thread, a pattern no one had dared to acknowledge. She walked back into the house and paused at the foot of the stairs. A faint light glowed in the study. She stepped inside. "Miss Marple," said Edward, sitting at the desk, his eyes sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. "They say it's Daniel, that they found him." "They're right." Edward's hands trembled slightly. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple said quietly, taking a seat across from him, "about patterns, about buried things, not just bodies, but secrets, guilt, and motives." His jaw clenched. "The cushion," she continued, "the tree, even Rupert's insistence on rebuilding the pond. I think he knew." Edward stiffened. "Daniel never ran away, did he?" There was silence. Then very slowly Edward looked up. "He wasn't supposed to die." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, sadness flooding through her. "He found out," Edward continued, voice barely audible, "about Rupert, about the investments, the debt. Rupert had plans for Daniel's trust. But Daniel was smart, too smart. He confronted him. And Rupert silenced him," Miss Marple finished softly. Edward didn't deny it. "But then why kill Rupert years later?" she asked, though the answer had already begun to form in her mind. "Because someone else found out." Edward rose. "That someone was me." She regarded him calmly. "And instead of going to the police, I wanted to destroy him," Edward said, breath shallow. "Not just ruin his name, kill him with the same cold precision he used on Daniel. I planned it. The party, the fire. I left the door unlocked. I knew he'd wander back down to the study. I waited for the moment. I knew how he moved. I knew how he drank." "And the Christmas card?" she asked. "I sent it. I wanted him to know he'd never escape, that someone remembered." Miss Marple sat very still. "But then," Edward hesitated, eyes flaring, "I didn't set the fire." The words hung in the air. She blinked. "What?" "I drugged his drink. I left him in the chair, but I was going to call the police, confess it all. When I returned, the flames had already started." Miss Marple felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "There's another hand in this," she said. Edward nodded grimly. "Yes. Someone else wanted Rupert dead, just as much as I did." The pattern was still forming, but now the shape was more complex than ever. And somewhere in the house, the true killer was watching, waiting. and very much still free. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing little Wytham in silence, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple sat quietly by the drawing-room fire in the Blanchard home, knitting in her lap, her eyes drifting between the slow movement of the flames and the window where frost crept in delicate spirals. She had spent the better part of the day revisiting old statements, prompting conversations anew, and walking the path from the lane to the house again, her eyes on the ground, retracing steps not just physically but psychologically. The threads were beginning to weave themselves together, not by force, not by suspicion, but by the quiet insistence of detail, of behaviour, of memory. She was not a woman of modernity, Miss Marple. She was a woman of observation. And it was now, in the quiet after the second murder and the disarray of the investigation, that the pieces began to speak. She thought of Lydia Blanchard again, how her grief had felt brittle, how her voice had trembled only when it ought not to, the way she had refused cocoa on the first night. Such things might seem meaningless, but Miss Marple had made a life from observing what others called inconsequential. And then there was the diary, the one discovered in Philip's childhood trunk, stashed in the attic beneath a false bottom. Constable Reed had found it 2 days ago and deemed it of sentimental value only. Miss Marple had read it twice, slowly, noting every repetition. Philip's handwriting had been cramped and jagged, like a boy trying to fit his voice into too small a space. One passage returned to her again and again. She told me to lie. Said I had to lie if I wanted to stay. But the lie was big, and I didn't understand it. She said it wasn't a real lie, just a way to make things easier for everyone. Who had she been? Lydia? Or someone else? Miss Marple had returned to the churchyard at dusk, where Philip's name was freshly etched into stone, and where the first boy, Christopher, had been buried all those years ago. Their deaths were decades apart, but somehow they rhymed. It was at that graveside that the realization came to her, not as a thunderclap, but as a subtle tightening in her chest. She remembered an old case in St. Mary Mead, a woman who had poisoned her husband not out of hatred, but to protect a secret she thought too damaging to be revealed. That same strange, protective desperation pulsed underneath the surface here. She returned to the house that evening and asked to speak with Mrs. Lydia Blanchard alone. The others, Inspector Rowntree, Mrs. Finch, and the widowed vicar, reluctantly agreed. Lydia sat stiffly in her chair, hands clasped like she was ready for a sermon, not a reckoning. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if I might ask you a rather personal question." Lydia gave a tight nod. "Did you know Philip was not your brother's child?" Lydia blinked. Her face did not change, but her hands did. One thumb began rubbing the other unconsciously, rhythmically. "I have no idea what you mean." "No, but I think you do. Philip was not John's child. He was Christopher's." A long pause. The fire popped and hissed as if startled by the statement. Outside, the wind blew snow from the eaves in gentle flurries. "You forget," Miss Marple said. "I've known this village for a very long time. I remember when Christopher was found at the foot of the ravine. They said it was an accident, but I remember the whispers about him and the girl who worked at the manor. Sarah, I believe her name was?" Lydia's jaw clenched. "You were young then," Miss Marple continued softly, but not unaware. "Sarah left suddenly, didn't she? Sent to a home for girls. And then months later, a child appeared. Your mother claimed he was adopted, but no papers were ever filed. It was all handled quietly." "You can't know that," Lydia whispered. "No one can know that." "I didn't know for certain until the diary," Miss Marple said. "Philip knew, or suspected. He wrote of a lie he was told to protect. He thought it was a small thing. But secrets like that, my dear, they grow. I suspect he confronted you about it when he returned." Lydia stood then, but not in outrage. She stood like a woman surrendering a great weight she'd carried too long. "I didn't kill him," she said. "I swear. I never would have." "You loved him, in your way," Miss Marple said. "I believe that. But someone else knew, and they feared what Philip would say." A silence hung, heavy with the weight of the past. It was father, Lydia whispered. Our father. He made us lie. He told Mother that if anyone found out about the baby, we'd be ruined, that the shame would bury us. He made me swear to pretend Philip was my brother, to keep it quiet. I was 15. What choice did I have? Miss Marple nodded. And you kept that promise, even when Philip returned asking questions. But someone else, someone who still clung to your father's legacy, must have decided to silence him. The silence between them was longer now, more fragile. It was not just about inheritance or blackmail. The motive had festered beneath the surface for decades. Shame, fear, and the cruel weight of old patriarchal pride. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Rowntree, the fire now dimmed, the household quiet. She laid out everything with the patience of a gardener explaining how a tree had withered. The second murder, the Maid, it wasn't random, she said. She overheard the argument between Philip and Lydia. She told someone, perhaps seeking a reward, but instead it cost her her life. And who did she tell? Rowntree asked. I believe she told the gardener, Mr. Howarth. He was more than a groundskeeper, you see. He was a staunch old loyalist to Mr. Blanchard, the father, a man who believed in protecting the family reputation at any cost. Rowntree's brow furrowed. But why now, after all these years? Because Philip threatened to expose it all. He didn't care about inheritance, he cared about truth. But truth, for some, is more dangerous than lies. The inspector sighed, eyes low. We'll arrest Howarth at first light. But Miss Marple knew the damage had already been done. 2 lives taken, a family fractured by secrets buried under decades of snow. As she stepped outside into the cold, the village was quiet once again. The mystery, at last, was clear. But Miss Marple, in her heart, felt no triumph, only the sad understanding that sometimes the deepest crimes were not those punished by law, but those left to fester in silence, whispered from generation to generation until someone brave enough, foolish enough, dared to dig them up. And sometimes they paid for it with their life. The library at Fern Hollow had not known such silence since its doors first opened nearly a century ago. It was the sort of silence that made one feel as though time itself held its breath. Miss Marple stood in the centre of it, hands folded neatly before her, as if she had merely wandered in for a quiet read. But everyone else in that room knew better. They stood around her like chess pieces, the endgame finally in sight. Only one move left. I believe, Miss Marple said, her voice mild and yet carrying with unnerving certainty, it is time we ended this charade. Leonard Glass, red-eyed and jittery, shot a nervous glance at Inspector Cray. The inspector stood beside him, arms folded, face impassive, but watching closely. Olivia Ashcroft, pale as frost, stood near the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel. Mrs. Dunsley, the housekeeper, lingered by the door, wringing a tea towel with fingers that had done so for decades without betraying emotion, until now. Daniel, Olivia's cousin, had taken a chair by the window, trying to appear disinterested, though his foot tapped restlessly against the wooden floor. Miss Marple gestured to the worn armchair near the bookshelves. "If you please, Inspector." Cray nodded and lowered himself into the seat. Miss Marple remained standing. "Let us start with what we all agree on," she began. Simon Ashcroft was poisoned. Arsenic, introduced into the contents of his hip flask. A hip flask he rarely used, except on the exact sort of occasion when old family ghosts are likely to resurface. Cray gave a slow nod. "Now, I dare say many of you would like to believe this was about money or inheritance," she went on. "And in truth, those things certainly played their part. But the motive, the true motive why Simon had to die, is rooted in something much older, something far less transactional." Her gaze swept the room. A child? A collective breath caught in the stillness. Even the fire in the grate seemed to burn quieter. Miss Marple turned to Olivia. "You were not told, were you?" Olivia stared back, lips parting slightly, but no sound came. "Simon Ashcroft had a daughter," Miss Marple said gently. "Not a child of marriage, but of misstep. Long ago, before he left for Africa the first time. Her name was Eleanor. She was placed in an orphanage, and for years, no one in this house spoke of her again. Not even your father, who arranged the whole affair with the solicitor. Olivia took a step forward, her expression brittle. That's not possible. But it is, Miss Marple replied softly. Eleanor returned last year. Quietly. She visited Fern Hollow. She wrote letters to your father. And she confronted Simon. All eyes now turned to Leonard Glass, the lawyer. She came to see you too, didn't she? Miss Marple asked him. Leonard's lips trembled. Yes, he said finally. She claimed to be Simon's daughter. I didn't believe her at first, but she had proof. Photographs, letters, even a necklace with the Ashcroft crest. Very old, very rare. She didn't want money, Miss Marple continued. What she wanted was acknowledgement, a place at the table, perhaps a Christmas with her family for the first time. But Simon refused, and worse, he told her never to return, that no one would believe her, that the Ashcroft name was his to protect, not hers to share. A heavy pause settled. And that's when Eleanor planned her revenge? Daniel asked, his voice thick. Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear. Eleanor was many things, but not a killer. She left Fern Hollow and tried to let the matter rest. She died in a car accident 3 months ago. In Bath gasps broke out. Then, if she's dead, Cray began. Her death set someone else in motion, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone who loved her. Someone who blamed Simon for her rejection. Someone already close to the family. Someone who had heard. Whispers of Eleanor's visit, but never understood why Simon was so shaken until the truth emerged. Her eyes turned to Mrs. Dunsley. No one ever pays attention to the housekeeper, Miss Marple said. They don't see the letters tucked away in drawers. They don't notice the long glances or hushed voices. But you noticed, didn't you, Mrs. Dunsley? The old woman stared at her, pale, lips pressed tightly together. You were Eleanor's mother, Miss Marple said softly. You were barely 16 when Simon forced you to give her up. You stayed on here all these years watching the Ashcrofts live their lives while your child was cast out. And when she came back, you hoped, you prayed. But Simon crushed her again. And when she died, Mrs. Dunsley's voice broke through hoarse and raw. He killed her, not with a knife, but with his shame, his pride. He called her a stain on his name. Miss Marple said nothing, only let the silence expand. I didn't mean to poison him that night, the woman whispered. Not at first. I'd kept the arsenic from the old shed for the rats. But I saw the flask. He left it open, and I couldn't let it go. Cray rose slowly. Mrs. Dunsley, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Simon Ashcroft. The old woman turned, but not toward the door, toward the hearth, toward Olivia. I never meant to hurt the rest of you. I just wanted someone to say her name. She deserved better, Olivia whispered, tears running freely. Miss Marple stepped back as Cray moved forward, guiding Mrs. Dunsley away. No one in the room spoke for several moments, until the faint click of the library door closing broke the spell. The orphan who came home for one last Christmas. A Miss Marple mystery. Daniel spoke first. You knew all along, didn't you? Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. Not all along, but I've known enough mothers, enough grief to see when it runs deep. Olivia turned to her. Will she be hanged? That's not for me to say, Miss Marple replied gently. But sometimes justice wears many faces, not all of them cruel. And with that, she reached for her handbag and hat, as though the evening had simply grown long and she had a train to catch. As she stepped into the snowy night, the wind whispering through the trees, she thought of Eleanor Ashcroft, the orphan who had come home for one last Christmas, and of the mother who had waited too long to speak her name. The air in St. Albans was finally beginning to still, the frantic whispers of a town gripped by murder quieting as the alleged killer sat in custody, awaiting formal charges. But Miss Marple, her eyes sharper than ever, sat by the window of her room at the vicarage, a teacup untouched in her hand. Outside, the streets bore signs of calm, of the mundane creeping back in. But inside, something was wrong, deeply wrong. She had been reviewing her notes again that morning, a habit born from decades of mental housekeeping. The list of suspects, their alibis, their motives, all had seemingly lined up to support the recent arrest of Arthur Benton, the deceased's estranged nephew. Greedy, angry, and left out of a sizable inheritance, Benton had motive aplenty. The handwriting on the poisoned Christmas card matched his. The cyanide was traced to his lab. Even the witness testimonies had begun aligning. And yet, something gnawed at her. A single phrase she had overheard, not during a formal interview but whispered in the kitchen by the housemaid Mary, echoed back now with peculiar force. He said he hated the cold, Mary had told the cook absently, while drying a cup. Said it reminded him of that house in Dover. Miss Marple's hand trembled slightly, the teacup clinking against its saucer. That house in Dover. It was too particular to be offhand. Dover. And the cold. That wasn't Benton's history. She dressed quickly and made her way, hat pinned tight, to the local records office. A few polite words and an old favour called in led her to the archives. What she found stopped her breath. Gerald Langston. Yes, mild, well-spoken, grieving family friend Gerald had once lived in Dover under another name, Geoffrey Lake. His house had been subject to an unsolved case 20 years ago, a woman dead of poisoning. The victim? A woman with whom Langston, then Lake, had been romantically involved. No charges ever laid. A quiet disappearance after the scandal. He had reinvented himself, moved to St. Albans, and slipped comfortably into society once more. She recalled then the odd way he had reacted during her psychological game. The trembling hands not at the mention of poison, but of winter, of the cold. A memory too painful to hide. The trap had to be set with precision. Miss Marple invited Gerald for tea under the pretext of a communal morning. He accepted with polite gratitude. As they sat by the hearth, Miss Marple smiled gently. I came across an old article today about a woman poisoned in Dover. You wouldn't happen to recall the case, would you, Mr. Langston? Gerald's hand stiffened as it reached for the teacup. He hesitated. No, I'm afraid not, though Dover can be quite dreadful in winter. I don't blame anyone for trying to forget it. She let that hang in the air. They said the case was never solved, but it did involve a certain Geoffrey Lake. Now the cup slipped. Not shattering, not dramatically, just a gentle clink on the saucer, but enough to confirm it. I was very sorry to hear about Charles, she added softly, shifting topics, but not really. He was a proud man, but surely, Mr. Langston, you know better than anyone how the past can return. His eyes met hers, and something old and dead flickered behind them. So, you know, he whispered. Enough, she said, enough to understand that you weren't after the money, or the inheritance. You wanted to erase the man who once exposed your affair all those years ago. Charles knew your real identity, didn't he? Gerald didn't answer, but his posture changed. Gone was the grieving friend. In his place sat a man burdened by decades of silence, now laid bare. You knew he recognized you the moment you arrived at the vicarage for that first dinner, she continued. You watched him closely. The Christmas card, he must have said something mocking, something only he and Geoffrey Lake would understand. So you sent that card back to him, your message, laced with poison. Not out of vengeance for being found out, but out of fear. Fear he would tell everyone. He slumped slightly, like a balloon pierced by a pin. He said I owed him silence, that he'd keep my secret if I left the past buried. And you didn't believe him? I couldn't risk it, Gerald said. I built everything here, a new life, a new name. I couldn't let him take it. And so you killed him? A long silence, then softly. Yes. Miss Marple rang the bell, and the constable, stationed outside at her request, entered and took Gerald Langston, formerly Geoffrey Lake, into custody. Later, as she sat once again at the vicarage, the whole town buzzing anew with the revelation, the inspector approached her. We had the wrong man all along. We nearly locked up Benton for good. Miss Marple gave a tired smile. Guilt often wears the clothes of greed, Inspector. But true guilt, true darkness, hides in regret. Gerald Langston wasn't driven by money. He was driven by the terror of his old self being discovered. A fear far more potent than jealousy or revenge. The inspector stared. How on earth did you know? Her blue eyes twinkled just slightly. because in all my years I've found that a man who truly forgets the past never flinches at its mention. But Gerald always hated the cold. And with that, the last page turned, and the mystery was closed. Or so it seemed. The morning sun filtered weakly through frost-lined windows as the village of Little Witham stirred to life once more. The long, tangled mystery that had gripped the household of Fern Hollow was finally coming to its end, but the air was heavy with a weight that no single verdict could easily lift. Miss Marple sat at the worn oak table in the drawing-room, her hands folded neatly over a steaming cup of tea. Around her, the faces of the family and household staff held a spectrum of emotions: relief, sorrow, and, for some, something more elusive, lingering doubt. Inspector Cray paced slowly, eyes scanning the room. "So, with Langston's arrest, the case is closed?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled gently but shook her head. "Not quite, Inspector. There's one final truth we must address." She stood and moved to the window, gazing out where the frost clung stubbornly to the hedges. "Every step of this investigation," she began, "was shaped by details, some large, some small, that others overlooked or dismissed, and it is in those small details that the true story lies." She turned back to face the assembled company. The wax seal found on the glove at the initial crime scene, the one you all thought was merely a relic, was more than that. It belonged to the personal stationery of one individual, Edward Ashcroft. A murmur rippled through the room. Edward's face paled. "I don't understand," Miss Marple continued. "Edward was desperate, yes. He confessed to an intent to confront his father over matters of inheritance and pride, but he did not wield the poison." "Then who?" the inspector asked sharply. "That, dear Inspector, is the question that haunted me until this morning." She held up a delicate silver locket, its surface etched with the Ashcroft family crest. This was missing when the second victim, Harold Linton, was found. The room was silent. "The locket was found yesterday," Miss Marple said, "hidden beneath the floorboards in the study. But it had been altered. Inside was a folded photograph, not of the family as you might expect, but of a young woman not previously mentioned," Olivia gasped softly. "That young woman is Eleanor Ashcroft, the orphan who came home for one last Christmas." Miss Marple's eyes locked with Edward's. Someone close to the family, someone with access and the skill to move unnoticed, hid this locket to keep Eleanor's memory buried, to protect their own secrets. Edward swallowed hard. "You think it was you, Uncle Leonard?" Leonard Glass, the lawyer, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you mean," Miss Marple smiled, serene. "The evidence suggests otherwise. Leonard had the motive to prevent Eleanor's rightful place being acknowledged, to protect the estate and his own position." "But I never harmed anyone," Leonard said, voice low. "No," Miss Marple replied. "But your attempts to manipulate and bury the truth set this chain of tragedies in motion." The inspector frowned. "So, Leonard's not the killer?" "No," she said firmly. "He's a culprit in the lies. The poison was administered by Mrs. Dunsley as confessed. But Leonard's actions paved the path for tragedy." Miss Marple then fixed her gaze on a figure standing by the doorway, Eleanor's brother, Daniel Ashcroft. "You," she said quietly, "knew more than you shared. Your restlessness and evasiveness weren't mere youthful rebellion. They were fear." Daniel met her eyes squarely. "I never wanted any of this. But you were the one who removed the envelope, the one with the letter detailing the truth about Eleanor. You hid it, hoping to protect your family. But in doing so, you delayed justice." Daniel's voice faltered. "I thought I was doing right." Miss Marple nodded. "Intentions are not always justice's allies." The room grew heavy, with the realization that no single person bore the entire burden. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. "So, justice is complicated here." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Justice often is. The villain may be punished, but the true resolution lies in the reckoning of all who held secrets and chose silence over truth." As the morning light grew stronger, the villagers of Little Witham prepared to move forward. Some wounds would heal, others would scar. Miss Marple stood at the door, taking in the scene one last time before stepping out into the cold air. The snow had melted slightly, revealing patches of earth beneath. "Sometimes," she murmured to herself, "the hardest cases are not the ones with a culprit behind bars, but the ones where the heart remains tangled in shadows." And with that, she walked away from Fern Hollow, knowing that in her quiet way she had untangled the web that no one else could see, proving once again why she was always one step ahead. The frosty morning light filtered softly through the bare branches of the ancient oaks lining the lane, casting long shadows on the frost-hardened earth. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter against the cold as she made her way down the winding path away from Fern Hollow, the grand estate now a place of whispered secrets and fractured truths. The village was stirring, but for her the day felt quieter, almost suspended in the stillness that follows a storm. Her footsteps were light, yet purposeful. The mystery that had unfolded here was one of the most tangled she had encountered, stitched together with threads of lost children, buried sins, and fractured family bonds. Yet, as she walked, a small unease lingered, not in the facts she had uncovered, but in the spaces between them. Her mind drifted back to the final moments in the library, to the silver locket discovered beneath the floorboards. Eleanor's photograph inside had brought clarity, but something else had troubled her, a subtle irregularity in the stitching of the cushion Eleanor had once embroidered. It had been so carefully hidden, so painstakingly crafted, that Miss Marple had felt the weight of a secret beyond mere family shame. But what? She paused by a worn gate, looking out over the fields blanketed in frost. Her eyes caught a glint in the grass, a small rusted key half buried and oddly out of place amid the natural detritus. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm. It was old, its intricate bow patterned with the same ivy and holly motif she'd seen stitched on the cushion. Why had this key not been noticed before? Why was it here, so near to the hedge where the pond had been drained? A memory flickered. A soft click she had heard the night of the second murder, faint but distinct. Had someone used this key to hide or retrieve something important? A secret compartment, perhaps, in the old manor? The thought stirred questions, gnawing like the cold wind at her bones. She looked back towards the house, its windows glinting like watchful eyes, and wondered how many more secrets it still held. The family, the village, the shadows, they all moved forward, but shadows have a habit of stretching long and creeping back unexpectedly. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, a sparkle of anticipation in her gaze. The game was never truly over. Each mystery left echoes, whispers that teased at the edges of reason and memory. She tucked the key safely into her pocket and adjusted her shawl against the rising wind. There is always another story, she mused aloud, her voice soft as the falling snow. Another secret waiting to be uncovered. And with that, Miss Marple stepped into the road, her silhouette melting into the misty horizon, leaving behind the village of Little Witham, but carrying with her the quiet promise of mysteries yet to come.